Let's start our discussions of our international overview by looking at something called globalization. So for this particular section, we concentrate on the learning outcome that you will have been introduced to the changing global context for enterprise. So what do we mean by globalization? Well, in short, we can think of it as a summary of the combination of local conditions and global pressures that organizations face. When we talk about organizations here, we're talking about firms, companies, etc. And as Chell says, given increased pressures to globalize, standards of performance need to be matched at that level if the company is to hold its own. In other words, it's to survive. Offering products and services which can compete globally will also assure success in local markets. In this way, it may be argued that companies can be both globally and locally competitive. They can be global. So this is your first task. So what I'd like you to do now is press pause and in your own way, in your own words, either in a sentence or two or in a diagram if you prefer, write your own definition of what you think globalization means. Okay, you all done? Excellent. Let's look at globalization in a little bit more depth. And in particular, let's ask ourselves the question, what are some of the globalizing factors that contribute towards globalization? The first factor we can identify is that competition is changing. It's becoming increasingly global, especially on the basis of cost. What this means is that different countries are starting to be able to compete much more effectively on the basis of them being able to provide services or products or part of products on a much more competitive basis. Look at the impact of China and India in recent years and other rising powers. Now, in 2007, Goldman Sachs came up with the term the BRIC economies. It simply stands for Brazil, Russia, India and China. Countries that Goldman Sachs predicted to be especially effective on the basis of their competition. A bit later, they also came up with the mint economies as well. Malaysia, Indonesia, Nigeria and Turkey, 4 more supposedly rising powers. We can also see an example of how competition is changing by looking at global production chains. So, for example, with manufacturing hard disks, we can see how the global production chain is really quite dispersed geographically. At one time, the entire manufacturing process and the head office would have been focused in quite a local area. You can see now how raw materials are found in many, many different countries on the right-hand side there. Then they're shipped to specific countries for their manufacturing, most typically Thailand, China, Malaysia and Philippines. Whilst the head office is often located in the USA, Japan or Singapore. 2 other examples point to an increasingly global competition base. We can see, for example, a growing impact of multinational and or transnational companies. We can also see how capital is more easily moved around. It's more mobile. A typical example is looking at the football industry. So take a look at Manchester United's current squad. Manchester United are a major team in the English Premier League, and you can see just how many different nationalities are represented here. But not all sports teams are so international. So what I'd like you to do here now is just to pause and answer the following question. There's no need to take any notes, but bear in mind we're talking about the mobility of finance. Ask yourselves the question, why are some sports teams in some countries not as international, even though they may have the money to be so? For example, France and Italy. But let's move on to look at a second factor towards globalization. We can identify some regulations and legislative factors. So, for example, the World Trade Organization as an example of a global trade agreement. This is an organization that was set up basically to make international trade easier. We can also see customs unions and free trade areas. The European Union, for example, the North American Free Trade Association, comprising USA, Canada and Mexico, and the South Asian Free Trade Area, all set up to make trade easier. A third globalizing factor that contributes towards globalization is the international mobility of people, capital and knowledge. Now, we've already touched on capital to a certain extent. Why do people move? Why does knowledge move? Why does it move so much easier than before? What I'd like you to do now is just pause again and answer the following questions. If you have moved to study from another part of France or from another country, why did you personally move? What was the motivation behind your move? And if you've chosen to study in your hometown, why did you decide not to move to study elsewhere? Again, what was your motivation? Okay, so far we've looked at some of the global factors that contribute towards globalization. What about some of the local factors? Let's take clustering as our first factor. Marshall was writing in the 1920s, and since this time people have emphasised local clustering as shaping competitiveness in debates around agglomeration, innovation systems and industrial districts. In other words, clustering around local geographical areas can shape competitiveness. Let's take a look at Porter's Diamond, written in 1998. That was concerned mainly with local competitiveness. Okay, so Porter was identifying 4 different factors that contribute towards the competitive of local geographical areas. On the left-hand side there, you can see something called factor conditions. These just refer to the physical resources, human resources, and availability of knowledge, for example. On the right-hand side, you can see something called demand conditions. These just refer to the local demand of the market. Then we can see something called competitive rivalry. To what extent are these firms localised, competitive with each other? And finally, there at the bottom, to what extent are there supplier or support industries located within the vicinity, the local vicinity, of those firms competing with each other? Let's take a look at a second local factor that contributes towards globalisation. And in particular, let's look at how firm structure and development impacts on this. The key point to take away here is that different firms are different in the extent to which they are motivated entrepreneurially. If you look at your bottom left-hand screen there, you'll see a picture of J.B. Banks and Son, a traditional ironmongers that's located in the UK. This is not a large chain of ironmongers or locksmiths. It's a small mom-and-pop type business. Many, many years ago they started small, and they want to stay small. They don't want to grow. Compare that to McDonald's. Now, McDonald's, as you all know, is a large organisation, huge corporation. It's in almost every country of the world. But at one time, they started off as a small, tiny enterprise. But they've grown. The founders of McDonald's wanted to grow. So the extent to which they are motivated to grow differs quite a lot from that ironmonger. A third local factor are anti-globalisation movements. Now I've put a question mark here because you won't really find this in any of the current literature, but it is a growing force in sociological literature. So when we talk about anti-globalisation, we're largely talking about a social movement that is opposed to democracy and large corporations. And I put a couple of examples of how this has been manifested into real life. The first one we're going to talk about very briefly is transition towns, and secondly, local currencies. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on these slides, but feel free to pause and look at them in more depth, and maybe research them on the internet if you really like this area. So, transition towns, what are they? Well, it's an international movement to encourage localised solutions and foci to perceived negative effects of macro socioeconomic growth, especially peak oil and development, to create a more resilient world. What does that mean? Well, it simply means that it's a social movement that is dispersed almost globally now. And it's a movement that was concerned about how large corporations are using up some of our natural resources at a much greater rate than we can keep up with. And they really want to create localised solutions to the problem. So this is an organisation that is involved with many grassroots solutions, and you can see some of these over the next few slides. Now, as I said, I don't want to talk about these in too much detail here, but feel free to pause the following slides, and as I said, you can find more details of the organisation at www.transitionnetwork.org. So as our second example, let's talk a little bit about local currency. These are alternative currency systems that exist alongside mainstream currency. Their aim is to establish an internal trade barrier with the overall aim of encouraging that currency to stay within the local area. So on the right-hand side of your screen there, you can see something called the Totnes pound. Now, Totnes is a city or a small town in the southern part of the UK. The aim is to buy and sell that currency, and it can only be used to buy goods from local shops. So let's try and bring this all together, and let's take another look at Shell in 2001 and his model. Now remember, he was talking about combining global markets with local conditions to make an enterprise space. So let's see if we can add here cultural attitudes towards localization. This is quite important, and maybe it suggests that as a society we've moved on in our thinking since he was writing in the early part of the millennium. So what I'd like you to do now is just take a minute and just pause to answer the following questions. Which of these factors in Shell's diagram do you think are more important in shaping patterns of enterprise activity, and why? Think back to your own reasons as to why you moved from or stayed in your hometown to study. Are any of Shell's factors here relevant to you and your decision? So, when you've thought about those questions and when you're ready, you can now click on 1C,